All right, welcome everyone. We're just going to do some quick chatting about hooks. Is anyone here familiar with React hooks? And so I'm assuming the rest are not. Has anyone not heard of React or hooks? Or just hooks? Just hooks, okay. So in React, there are two different types of components that we can create based on their signature. There are class components, which is used with the class syntax. In fact, I have one here. So we have a class, we give it a name, we extend React.component. And this has been a very useful type of component. And then we also have function components, which are just functions that render something. You can put your own logic into them, but you can't use like internal state or have access to lifecycle methods, which class components can have. And that's why class components were pretty much the preferred type of component for a while, simply because you can do so much more with them. You can hold values in them. You can re-render based on the changing of those values. You can determine when they are being rendered to the DOM or being destroyed from the DOM, every time they update, et cetera, et cetera. So React hooks is they let you use state and other React features without writing a class. So React is taking the direction of let's make everything just functions. They're easy to write, they're easy to compose. React by itself is a composable framework of components. And so they just went along this line. I believe this was their intention all along. In fact, classes were originally just functions that created something that looked like a class. They just created this object with functionality built into it. So we're going to start there. We're going to go over just a quick intro to what this little application is here. I'm going to modify it to use hooks. Right now, all it's doing is rendering a message with some text. So this is a component called message that takes in some props and displays props.text. That's pretty simple. There's really nothing much to it. Here's the overall application. There's this view class, which is that class component. There's also a store view. We're going to get into that a little bit later with state. We're going to do some little state management stuff with this. It's going to be fun. So, message. Now, right now I'm just passing this data in as a prop. So it's going to render whatever I give it. If I wanted to get this from someplace else, I have a couple options. I can grab it from the parent component that may be passing that data down into this, not entirely exciting. Or I can set up an internal state inside this class component. So it can track and change and have the ability to hold on to that data, whatever I want to pass down into message. So we're going to start by creating some internal state for this class. And I'm not going to explain everything about React and class components and state and everything, because this really just is about hooks. So if you're interested in what all this stuff is I'm talking about, I highly encourage you to check out the React docs. They're fantastic. They're written very well in plain English. There's not a lot of jargon. So I'm going to kind of breeze through this to keep it short and succinct and just get to the meat. So we're going to set this up by giving it a constructor. Constructor takes props, and we call super props. Again, this is just the pattern. If I want to create state inside this class, I need to tell it that this instance of this class, whenever it's invoked or whenever it's instantiated in memory, it needs to know where it can find this thing, and it needs to know that it comes from itself. So we say this.state, this meaning the instantiated component. And state could be anything you want it to be, typically an object. We'll give it a message key and a value. Now, in order to get this, we can come down to here to our JSX, evaluate this.state.message, re-render this, and we see now we're pulling this data from internal state of this component. I could have many of these components, and each will have its own instance of this particular state. So they'll handle, if this state changes, it'll only change for that particular component, not for another instance of it. So it does all this internal tracking. If I want to change this text, I can say create a button, and we'll just say update message. And on click, something will happen. Not exactly sure what yet. We'll have to create some sort of event handler. So when I click this thing, I want to handle that event. I want to do something with it. In this case, I want to update the message and state. So I'll say handle click. That's going to be a function that accepts an event, which is, in this case, will be the click event. So I can pass this.handleClick into here. This being, again, that instance of that component. And then I can come down here and I could say this.setState. And the message, we're going to change that to event. No, there's not. I'm thinking of an input. Hold on. Let's not do that. We don't need the event. Got ahead of myself. We'll just say hi from button. Sure. Now here, there's a little gotcha here. If I click this, nothing's going to happen. Okay, well, why not? Well, there's this funny little thing about lexical scope and all this closure stuff that I'm not going to go into, but suffice it to say, there is one more step we need to take in order to bind this event handler to this particular instance of this component. So I will say this.handleClick equals this.handleClick.bind to this. That's awful. No one wants to write this stuff. It's terrible. Yeah. And it's not working because I'm not returning the function. I don't want to do that. I just want to click it. Yay, hi from button. All that just to change text from state to hi from button. Not, not the most fun experience, and it looks confusing, especially if you're new to it. Does that look confusing to you? Yes, of course. Like, no one wants to write that stuff. So we can simplify that with hooks. Like the documentation says, you can use state and other React features without writing a class. So we can just have a simple function. In fact, we're going to create a new function. And we'll just say view, because it's not going to be a view class. And that's going to be a function that takes. In fact, I don't even care about props coming in at this point. I just want to render something. I'm going to return some markup. And the markup I'm going to return is essentially this. So I'm going to get rid of that. We're going to get rid of this. We'll just say function, date message. And get rid of this thing. We'll just go to just something like that. Now, if I export this, if I go to app, I'm going to import my view. Just change this. And now I'm rendering the same markup, but now I'm using a function. I don't have access to this set state anymore. I don't have access to like most cases of this that you would think you'd have access to. But we don't need that. So we're going to pull in a feature called use state. So there's some naming conventions with hooks and some rules that we'll get into. The one hook you'll see the most is use state, pretty much. I think I write that 90% of the time that I'm using hooks. That and one other that I'll get into next. And what this allows us to do is have access to the same internal state mechanisms that a class component would have access to. The syntax is a little different. I'll just write it out first and then explain it. So I'll just say message, set message, equals use state. Oops, what happened there? Oh. Use state. Okay. Instead of this, I'm going to say, whoa, 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 message. hide from use state. So what's happening here is I'm tapping into this use state hook. What I'm first doing is giving it an initial value. You can give it any initial value you want. It could be a string, it could be null, it could be a number, it could be Boolean, array, object, whatever you want. It could be nan. whatever real value you want to give it. And what we're doing, is anyone here not familiar with destructuring? Everyone's heard of destructuring, not quite familiar with it? So essentially what we're doing is we're saying, hey, this use state invocation is going to return me something. In this case, it's going to be an array. And I want to take out the first and second elements of that array. Essentially what this line of code says. The first thing use state gives us back is the value that it's holding, the value that you want to track. The second thing it gives you back is what's called an updater function. It's a function you can use to change that value in state. Every time that value of state changes, it will re-render the component and then show you that current value, or use that current value. It may not be displayed. You may be using it for something that's not visual. But in any case, this is a function that will change this. So how do we do that? Well, on click, we could say, every time I click this button, I could say set message. Just like that. So I don't have to go through this whole rigmarole down here. I can literally say, hey, give me this piece of state and give me a function to update it, and we're just going to do it. Right? So it's a highly simplified version of all that other set state stuff. But you can only use these in functions. You cannot use these in class components. There's really no need to. They each have their own way of handling state. They're both going to do the exact same thing under the hood, using the same mechanisms, but this is a little bit more succinct, actually a lot more succinct, and you can do all kinds of different things with this. With hooks, you can compose different functions together to create your own hooks. We're not really going to get into that too much because I don't want to confuse right off the bat. But that's our first hook, is use state. We're just going to create a piece of state and have a function to update it. I can still pass these down to other components via props if I want to. In fact, I'm doing that right here. So the text is a prop. It's going to take a piece of data, and it's going to render it inside the component. It's inside the message component. And I can pass these things around however I want. So I can pass this updater function down to message, and it could handle that as well, if message did want to handle that. So it's very useful, and it's a very quick way to set things up. All right, so the next hook we're going to talk about, any questions on use state so far, on hooks in general? Does it all seem straightforward? It's just a function to return some stuff, and we can use it. We're going to go into another hook called use effect. So with class components, not only do we have access to internal state, but we also have access to lifecycle methods that will fire at various different stages of the lifecycle of that component. So when it mounts to the DOM, when it updates, when it gets destroyed out of the DOM. So you have access to those things in the class component. You don't have access to those same functions inside a function component, but you do have access to this thing called use effect, which you can use to basically mimic those behaviors. So use effect, you literally just call it, and it takes two arguments. The first is a function. That's the function that's going to happen when the effect kicks off. And there's a second argument that it'll take. I'll get that in a second. I don't want to jump ahead too quick. So the way this is set up right now, I'm just going to do, let's see. Oh, I don't want to comment that out. Open up the console. I'm going to save this. I'm going to re-render. Okay. Every time this component renders, this effect is going to fire off. So in this case, it fired off when it was mounted, simply because it's going to literally go from top down. It's going to do everything that you tell it to. because that's what a function does. It just runs right through the lines of code. So it's going to come across this use effect. It's going to fire this thing off. It's just going to log something out. When I update this message, this component's going to re-render. Use effect is going to fire again because this component is re-rendering. This entire component function is being invoked again, essentially. You can think of it that way. So every time it re-renders, this is going to fire. Now you may think, well, that's great, that's awesome, but what if I only want it to fire on mount? I want my component did mount back. I really love component did mount. I hate that it's not there. Life is awful. How do I get that back, right? That's dramatic, of course. For some, it's not. But anyways, so how do we get it to do that? Well, use effect also takes a second argument, which is an array of dependencies. When one of these dependencies changes, it's going to fire this effect. If I don't give it any elements in this array, use effect will fire the first time it's found. It will fire once. And then React's going to say, hey, I see you have a dependency array. Let's see what you got in there. Oh, there's nothing. I'm not going to track this anymore. I'm only going to fire it the first time it's rendered. So when I re-render this, I can update this all I want. And it'll never fire again because it's not tracking anything. It doesn't need to. If I was tracking message, did I cause... Oh, I didn't. No. I think it's preventing me from... I think it's going to cause an infinite loop, to be honest. Because every time I hit this, it changes. I don't know. Anyways, so what this basically is an array of dependents, values that you want to track the changes of. So if you have props coming into this component that are different on different re-renders, you may want this use effect to fire when one of those props changes. Every time it sees that change, it's going to fire this thing. That's essentially what it does. So in most cases, in fact, I'd say 75% of the time, I'm only using use effect on mount, basically. There's not a whole lot of stuff I want to track outside of that. Then there may be other things like I said, props that are changing that are coming into this component. Maybe I want to fetch some stuff from a database based on a new user ID that's coming into this as a prop or something like that. So basically what we have here is access to changes that this component exhibits, right? So whether it's mounted to the DOM, I can't even talk, mounted to the DOM, when it re-renders, if something changes during that re-render, let's say component did unmount, or component will unmount. That's an old method that was available to class components. Right before it's removed from the DOM, that method will fire. In order to do that, use effect also can return something. And what you can return is a function that will run when that component will be unmounted, which is essentially access to component will unmount. So I can do something in here like remove all elements from the DOM, right? I can do whatever I want in this function. When it gets unmounted from the DOM, that will fire, and all hell will break loose because the DOM is destroyed. So we can have fun with that. So those are the three different ways you can use use effect. You can have it fire all the time. You can fire when it mounts or when it unmounts. Or actually four, because you can track dependencies and basically you have your component did update. So you have the access to that as well. All within this one function, which is really handy. You don't have to remember all the names of all these different functions, but you do have to remember all the ways that you write use effect. So 6 in one, half dozen in the other. But now we can do this inside function components, which is very, very handy. Now I'm going to get rid of this because we don't need that. Now there's a bunch of other hooks that we have access to. The main ones that are going to be used most of the time, use state, use effect, use context. Yeah, sometimes. Is anyone here not familiar with React context? Just three. Okay. So just a quick thing on context. Let's say you have a very large component tree. You have this component that's at the top. and maybe 6 levels of children down, you have this other component, and this like great-great-grandfather component needs access to its great-great-grandchildren, needs to pass some data down to it. Well, how do you get data down to there without state management? You pass it as a prop to the next component down, and that passes it down to the next component, and so on and so on and so forth, until it finally gets to the component that's expecting that data. That's called prop drilling. And it's just not fun. You can easily lose track of what things are called, what's expecting what data. You could rename something and it destroys that whole kind of data flow. Context is a way to hold a value way up here in the component tree. Anywhere down the line, you have access to that value through what's called a consumer. So there's going to be some provider of a piece of data at some level in the component tree, and then you have a consumer that's the other half of that just reads that data. But it has to be somewhere in the child tree of the provider. The provider can only give data to its children. You can kind of think of it like DNA in a family tree. Only you have access to that DNA. Or some DNA repository that you gave your life and signed your life away to. In this case, you can't do that. Provider will only give data to its children. As long as there's a consumer somewhere in that component tree, you can access the data from the provider. The value from the provider, I should say, if I want to be very technical. Okay, so what else do we have access to? There's some additional hooks. They call additional hooks. UseRef is another one that I've seen used quite a bit. I don't use it quite often. Is anyone here familiar with refs in React? Or not familiar with refs in React? I should start there. All right, so a ref is basically a reference to some element in the DOM. Think of it like that. Let's say I have another button, and we're just going to say update message 2. Right. I'm going to pull in useRef, and I'm going to create an instance of that. I'm going to get rid of this use effect. Just taking up space. All right, so I'm going to say const, and I'll say button L as in a button element. I want a reference to this button element, this update message 2. I want a reference to that. I'm going to say useRef, and I'm just going to pass in null because I don't know what that's going to be yet. I haven't gotten that far down in my lines of execution to know what that reference is yet. Nothing's been mounted to the DOM, so I can't really give it anything unless it was passed down from props. And, we can get all technical on that. But so I have this reference, but nothing's in it yet. Down here on this button, I'm going to say ref equals button L. So when this thing renders, update message 2 is being referenced up here in my code. That's actually very useful for certain things. Let's say you have, well, in fact, let's just do a quick example. Let's say instead of updating the message, let's actually flip this around. Let's put the reference on this button, and this button is going to do something with that. So just so we know, this still updates our state, right? We could still do that. But this one's going to say button L dot current, current meaning the current reference that's being held, and then I can do something with it. I could say click it. So I can click this button, and that's going to force the other button to click. If this was, say, an input element, I could force that element to be focused. Like, say, when you have a form that renders to the DOM, and you want a very specific form field to be the first one that's focused. You can use useRef to say, you know, that element dot current dot focus, and it'll put your the document's focus right on that element, or blur, or click, or whatever you want it to be. So this is just access to that particular element that lives in the DOM. Does that pretty straightforward, right? It's just a reference to something. We can control it however we want. It's our little marionette. So that's use ref. We went through use effect. There's some other ones down here. Use layout effect is similar to use effect, except it's going to fire every time there's changes in the DOM. So let's say you want to check the size of an element. You see you're constantly tracking scroll position, right? If you only use effect, that effect will be fired whenever the component re-renders, not where it changes in the DOM. So if you want to track where you're scrolling, you'll have to use layout effect. So every time there's a change in the DOM, that's going to fire, and then you can grab access to all the changes that have happened. It's recommended that you don't use this often unless you absolutely have to, because it's going to fire every single time the DOM changes. You may not want that. You may have a bunch of things on the DOM that are just very data heavy, and it's maybe you see a lag and you're scrolling and stuff like that. I personally have never used it. I've never had to. I'll probably end up using it maybe once or twice. I don't know yet. We'll see. And there's a bunch of others that I'm not really going to get into, simply because A, I haven't used them yet or found a need to, or B, some of them make it kind of complicated, and I haven't found a great way to explain them from personal experience. So the docs do a really good job of that. So if you're interested, check out the docs. That's my cop-out. All right, so we are going to do 2 more of these hooks. We're going to check out use context and another one called use reducer. And what we're going to do is close this out. Actually, let's bring this back to just this. Let's get rid of all this stuff. Hide from view. All right. So all we have is, we're kind of back to square one. Let's say that we have a very, very complex component tree, and app is at the very highest level, which it is, and view is at the next level down, and then we have message. Let's just pretend message is like 20 component levels deep. Let's just say that. Excuse me. We don't want to prop drill data down to it. That's just unwieldy and just prone to bugs. How can we get data from the top level down to this bottom leaf node, this tree? Well, we can have some sort of state management solution. Context is one way to implement a state management solution. Most people hear state management, they think, oh, Redux or MobX or the flavor of the month, right? Quick store, that's another one. Some people in the room are familiar with that. And basically 2. So there are many ways to create state management solutions. You don't necessarily have to pull a state management solution off of somebody else's shelf, bring it into here, and use it in your app. You can create your own. And you can use that using hooks with use context. Now, I'm not going to go into the old way of using context. I'm not saying the old way, but the one mostly people associate with that is typically used in class components. We're going to focus on the hooks version. It's more succinct, and that's the topic of today. Let's see, where are we at on time? We're doing good. Okay, so I have this file called store, and we're going to implement this state management solution with hooks. And we're going to pull some inspiration off of Redux. So you're going to see, if you've seen Redux before, some of this will look familiar, or at least the patterns will feel familiar. So the first thing we want to do with context is establish a context. We have to do that in order to get our provider and consumer. That's the only way you're going to be able to pass data from one part of the tree down to the other. So let's do, we're going to import create context. And we're going to establish a context. We'll call this store context. And I can give it an initial value of anything I want. That's eventually going to change, so you can pass whatever in you want. Typically, what I've done in the past is I'll pass in, because most of the time I'm using this as an object. My context is usually an object that represents some piece of state. I'll pass in like the initial shape that the defaults will be, that I'll be expecting, right? So if message was part of that, I'd just give it some shape, right? So that's a trigger to me to say, oh, that's what this context is all about. There's these properties and so forth. In this case, we're going to be creating a store. So I'll just say there's going to be some state, and there's going to be a way to change the state through a dispatching action. So that's the shape of my store. That's what it's going to look like eventually. So I'm just going to create this context. And now I need to pull out, context gives me two things. It gives me provider and a consumer, as I said before. So now we need to create our provider that we can plug into our app somewhere. So what I'll do is I'll come down to store. Right now all this is doing is rendering its children. In fact, let's do this. Let's go to app and let's pull in store. And let's wrap our entire view in store. I can re-render this. And as you can see, everything's rendering fine. That's because this store is just rendering its children. Right now it's just view. That's the only thing that's a child of store. And to prove this out, I can do this. And I can see that show up, right? So I know my store is working as it's defined right now. But let's get that provider in there. So instead of a div, do that in here? Yes. I could say store context dot provider. Oh, leave it like that. Now provider takes a value because that's the value they need to pass around that the consumers need access to. So I'll give it a value. In this case, it's going to be some object. We'll just say that we're not going to do that. No, yeah, we will. Hi from provider. So that's the value that's in our provider. But we don't really have access to that yet until we have a consumer. So let's create a consumer, and we can use the hook called use context. And I'm going to export a new constant. I'm going to call it use store. What I'm basically doing is I'm creating my own hook in this case. But all it's really doing is rebranding the hook called use context. This is essentially what I'm doing. And that'll make sense in just a second. Oops. Use context. Now use context requires you to give it a context. Of course, hence the name. So now I have a function that's going to return an instance of whatever this use context gives me. I can come over to my app, or no, I don't want to go in app. Let's say I want to go to my leaf node, which is message. And let's import our consumer, which is use store from store. Now, just like use state, I'm going to create a constant. Now, in this case, I need to know what my value is from provider in order to know what to pull out of this thing. So I'm just going to call it store. I'm going to call use store. Now I have access to this store thing. I'm consuming whatever provider is giving me at this point. I'm not really doing anything yet. Let's just put it on the screen. Create a pre-tag, so pre-formatted text. JSON.stringify. It was going to show up. That's my quick tip there. I'm not going to use the replacer function. And let's just take a look at store. Not a very pleasant view. But we can see that we see this object message hi from provider, right? That's the value we gave to provider. So we know we're consuming it. Now let's actually do something useful. Let's go into store. Let's get rid of this. Let's continue to set up our state management solution. We know that our context is working. We consume this value, but outside from that, it's really not very useful, right? There's just one value in there. We don't have a way to change that. And up here, we did say that we want state and some dispatch thing to be able to change state. So let's set that up. We're going to use something called use reducer or recutter. Reducer. I can't spell, apparently. Use reducer. Is anyone here not familiar with Redux? All right. So Redux is a state management solution. It uses this pattern of these reducer functions. And each reducer has access to state, whatever the current state is, and an action that's being dispatched to it. So these reducers are essentially like little listeners. They say, okay, there's an action that fired or that was dispatched. I'm going to grab my state, I'm going to grab the action, and I'm going to determine if that action applies to me. You can have as many reducers as you want. You can say, okay, well, what type of action is this? Oh, I see it's update message. Cool, I want to react to that. Right? I want to do something with state, with this new action that's coming in. Or let's say it was, update scroll position. Maybe my reducer doesn't care about that, right? Maybe another reducer does. So that's just the pattern, right? So you can dispatch these actions, and these reducers will decide if they want to react to that or not, if they want to update state based on that or not, et cetera, et cetera. So in our case, the only thing we're going to work on right now is just updating the message that's in our component here. Keep it real simple. So let's do this. We need use reducer, which I imported here. And use reducer takes two things. It takes a reducer. And as I said before, reducer is a function that accepts state and some action. Ooh. That's not correct syntax. And then I can do something with that action. I'm not going to do anything just yet. And then use reducer also takes something called an initializing value. So I'll just say initial state. And I'm going to take this out of here. Oh, I just copied it. Hi from context, or hi from the store. That's where it's coming from. Now my value is different now. It's no longer that other thing. We're going to get to that in just a second. We'll get to use reducer first. In fact, just so I don't look at that over and over. Let's see. Reducers, those are functions. They get past state in the action. I want to determine if this reducer is supposed to react to that action. And one way to do that is to do a switch statement on the action.type. Now this is a generally accepted pattern. Actions are typically, an action could be anything, but they're typically objects. And that object typically has a property called type. So that'll say, literally what type of action do I want to take? And in the switch statement, we have cases. So in the case of having, say, update message, I want to do something with that. I'll give it a default state or default case. And that's just going to be returning state as it is. No changes. That's all that really means. But if that action object has a type property, and that type property is update message, I probably want to update the message. So I'm going to say, I'm going to return a new version of state, and I'm going to update the message property. And on your actions, you can define other properties other than type. Typically, the common accepted pattern is to give it a payload. So what is the payload? Now, the way I typically use Redux, personally and at work, is my payload is always an object. Always. The payload is never anything but an object. And there's certain reasons why I do that. But this payload is an object, and that has a message property. The biggest reason, I'll just explain why I do this. The biggest reason I want payload to be an object is because now the code is essentially self-documenting. I know that, like if I have a message and I say, oh, action.payload, payload could be anything, right? In this case, it's specifically something called message, and that's what I'm updating. So again, self-documenting code. So here we have this initial piece of state, this reducer function that's listening for actions. If that action has a type of update message, we're going to take that action's payload message property and we're going to use that as our new piece of state for message. Otherwise, we'll just return state as it is. So now let's use our useReducer. useReducer gives us an array of 2 elements, just like useState does. And the first thing useReducer takes is the reducer, and the second thing is that initializing value. Now, this is going to give me 2 elements back. The first element, just like useState, is my value, in which case I'm just going to call it state. And the second is an updater function, which is my reducer. I'm going to call it dispatch. Or I'm sorry, a dispatching function, not the reducer. This is the reducer that listens to the dispatching of the actions. So now my value, I'm just going to repeat that down here. State and dispatch. So if I come over to my message, again, I have access to the store thing. Now, in this case, store is an array because that's what my value is. So I can use that same destructuring syntax and pull out my state and dispatch. I can come down to my message, and instead of it coming from props, I'm going to say state.message. From the store. So now I have this, we just change these so they're in the right order. So I have my store behind the scenes, sort of. I have my app, my top level, that has my store wrapper around my child component tree. This is my provider. Inside the view, nothing's changed here. In fact, I don't even need to pass this. I have this message, and inside the message, I have this consumer that I have access to my piece of state, in this case state.message. So I've essentially implemented a miniature version of just the data flow of Redux, right? And I haven't pulled in any separate libraries. This is all available to React without any other npm installs. So now we want to change what's in state. We have this sorry. Can you edit that? We have our dispatch method. They have to rename these things. They're just too close. We have our dispatch message, or dispatch function. We want to use this thing, right? We want to update state. One way to update state is via buttons, because buttons are fun. So let's come back up a level, and let's implement a button. And we'll just say update message. Now we have our button. Cool. And on click is going to do something. And we want access to that dispatch. Well, dispatch is over here. So since we're not using it over here, well, in fact, let's just do this. Copy this. We'll leave it there. We'll bring that into here. Make sure we import our use store as well. Copy paste is your friend. It's the quickest way to generate code. So now I have access to my consumer inside this component. And I have access to state and dispatch. I don't really care about state right now, but I do want dispatch. So let's dispatch an action. Now, as I was saying before, the common pattern is to give it an object. The object has a type. In our case, we want a type of update message. And then we give it a payload. In this case, it's an object with the property message. Hi from button click. So now I can save that, click this, and I'm updating state. Right? So this is literally a miniature version of Redux. Right? It's essentially what Redux is doing. You have this provider, this consumer, you have access to state and some way to dispatch actions to change that state. And we did it in 37 lines of code, half of which are blank lines or comments. That's pretty cool, right? We just used 2 different hooks and context under the hood. And now we have that. There's another aspect to Redux where you can have side effects, which is called Redux Thunk. So a thunk is really just, it's a subroutine that fires after another subroutine finishes. Callback function. Think about it that way. So right now, I can't really do anything asynchronously with this. I can dispatch an action, and it's going to reduce on that action and go right away. Right? What if I want to delay that? Right? So there's a pattern with Redux Thunk where instead of giving the dispatcher an action, you give it a function. That function will fire, do its thing, and then inside there you have access to the dispatch method, and then you can dispatch an action after the thing you're waiting for it to complete is complete. That's the whole pattern. Now to do that with Redux, you can use Redux Thunk as middleware, so which is basically just a fancy plugin that says, hey, if it's an or if the action's an object, or if the action's a function, fire the function, and then do whatever you want. Here's the dispatch, and here's access to state and some other stuff, and go nuts, right? So let's implement that real quick. Sounds complex. You may think, oh my God, how am I going to implement that? Really not that difficult. In fact, we don't even need to import anything else. We just need to know the pattern. And the pattern is, if my action is an object, it's synchronous. If my action is a function, I'm going to assume that it's asynchronous, and I'm just going to fire that function. Right? We'll just think about it that way. It doesn't have to be an asynchronous function, but we'll just think about it that way. Because most of the time when you're firing, giving functions to a dispatcher, it's usually an asynchronous operation. Okay, so inside our store component, we're going to create something called a dispatcher. And that's a function that takes an action. And now we want to determine what type of action is being given to this dispatch. So if type of action is a function, what do we want to do? We want to call it. And inside this action, this function, we want it to have access to the dispatch method. Cool. Now it can do it whatever it wants. Otherwise, we're just going to dispatch the action, just as normal. So instead of dispatch, this is actually going to be dispatcher. I forgot an arrow. Red squiggles are your friend. Okay. So now we have 2 different patterns we can use. We can dispatch actions normally with button clicks like this, or we can give it a function. So let's create a function, and we'll just say, we'll call it update message, because that's what we're going to do. It's a function, and we're just going to give a set timeout. This is an asynchronous operation, and we're going to do this after 2 seconds have elapsed. So every action that's a function expects to receive some sort of dispatch operation. So after 2 seconds, I'm going to dispatch an action of type update message. Oops, make sure it's exact. A payload message. Hi from set timeout. Okay, cool. So now we can pass update message. Oh, this has to be a function that returns, right? Think about this. So it's a function that returns update message. In this case, I don't need to call it. I'm doing it a little bit backwards. I need to call this because I need the return value. Sorry about that. Hold on a second. This is going to look confusing at first, but I swear it's on purpose. All right, so update message is going to return to me a function that has not yet been called, right? Because dispatcher wants to call that thing. We don't want to call it. So update message returns a function that's going to accept a dispatch. And down here, oops, we're going to call update message, which will return that function that has not yet been called, give it to dispatch, and dispatch is going to take care of that for us. So now if I come over to here and I click update message, 1, 2, set timeout. All right, so now, cool, we can handle synchronous updates of state and asynchronous updates of state. And the only thing we did different were these lines of code right here. That's it. We just checked to see if action was a function or if action was an object. And now we have access to very powerful patterning that we can use and work on top of that. And that's essentially a state management solution all on its own. And what I'll do is I will share in Slack the link to this particular code sandbox. So if you want to check it out or completely plagiarize it, go for it. Right? Free reign. That was a lot of information. Did it seem straightforward? I mean, did it feel very confusing? Or does it seem like something you could pick up after a couple tries? All right, cool. That's it. Thanks. Any questions on anything that I presented?
Slightly off topic. What's Quick Store?
Okay, so the question was, what is Quick Store? Quick Store is a context-based state management component library that I authored, that we use at work, and I use personally at home, which is essentially like a beefed up version of what I just did here, basically. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Any other questions? Any on-topic questions? That wasn't that off-topic, right? It's part of the conversation. Anything else? Wow, either I did a terrible job and you're so afraid to talk to me, or I actually did decent.
I don't know too much about React yet.
That's perfectly fine, yeah. So this is a nice little introduction of what's to come should you choose to go down the React path.
Oh, I already have. My primary focus is JavaScript. I've checked out Angular and Vue, but React seems like the most
Cool. So yeah. So are you in the Slack
No.
JavaScript Slack? Okay. So we'll let you know how to get there, and then if you want access to this, go for it.
That'd be awesome.
All right. Cool. Anything else?
Yeah, I have one question. Which file did you use to set the timing for the timeout?
Oh, that was in Vue.
That was in Vue.
Because that's where I was dispatching this action. Typically, you wouldn't put it like there. You would create like an actions file, and all your actions.
There it is right there. I
Yeah.
see it. Okay, 2 seconds.
Yep. So typically, you'll put all your actions that you want to dispatch into their own files, right? So if you have, like for example, we have a bunch of components at work that have their own actions related to how they're going to update state. So we keep those action files co-located to where those components are, right? Instead of just plopping it in the component like this, just to save time and reduce complexity. I just plopped it in right there. Anything else? All right. Thanks for coming out.